There is a question that the philosophy of mind has wrestled with for centuries without resolution. What is the relationship between the mind that thinks and the self that experiences the thinking? Who exactly is aware of your thoughts? The academic versions of this question fill entire libraries. But there is a version of it that is more immediate and more uncomfortable, one that does not require a philosophy degree to encounter, only a moment of genuine honesty. When you examine the person you believe yourself to be, how much of what you find is actually you, and how much is a story that has been running so long it has become invisible? The Stoics approached the philosophy of mind from a direction that modern academic philosophy rarely takes. They were not primarily interested in the metaphysical structure of consciousness. They were interested in something more practical and more pressing. What is the part of the mind that is capable of governing the rest? And are you using it? Their answer to that question produced one of the most precise and underused frameworks for self-understanding in the history of human thought. And it begins with a single, crucial distinction that changes everything once you see it clearly. Welcome to Logostoic. In today's video, we are going to examine what the Stoic philosophy of mind actually reveals about who you are, not as an abstract question, but as a practical confrontation with the difference between the self you perform and the self you actually govern. If content like this sharpens how you think, consider subscribing to Logostoic and turning on notifications. Now let's begin. Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoic school and the philosopher most responsible for systematizing Stoic thought, developed a concept that he called the hegemonikon, the ruling faculty. His argument was this: the mind is not a single, unified thing. It has components. There are impressions, the raw data of experience, the way things appear to you before you have done anything with them. There are impulses, the automatic responses those impressions generate, the pull toward or away from things before you have exercised any judgment. And then there is the hegemonikon, the capacity of the mind that receives all of this, examines it, and decides whether to endorse it or not. This distinction is not merely philosophical. It is the most practically useful map of the mind that Stoicism offers. Because most people, most of the time, do not distinguish between the impression and their response to it. They experience a thought and immediately treat it as true. They feel an impulse and immediately treat it as a command. The hegemonikon, the governing, examining, endorsing faculty, goes unused. And when it goes unused, you are not living your life. You are being lived by your impressions. What the philosophy of mind reveals, through this Stoic lens, is that the question of who you really are is inseparable from the question of which part of your mind is actually in charge. If your impressions are running the show, if you believe what you happen to think, want what you happen to feel, and do what you happen to be pulled toward, then what you call yourself is largely a function of circumstance. Change the circumstances, and the self changes with them. Praise you, and you feel worthy. Criticize you, and the confidence collapses. Give you comfort, and you soften. Take it away, and you become someone different. That is not a self at all. It is a weather system, responsive, variable, and owned by nothing. Marcus Aurelius returned to this insight again and again in his meditations, and the passages where he engages with it are among the most striking in the entire text. He describes the capacity to step back from one's own mental contents, to observe a thought without being the thought, to notice an emotion without being consumed by it, as the essential practice of a rational being. He writes about the mind that can withdraw into itself and find there a kind of stability that nothing external can disturb, not because the thoughts and emotions stop arriving, but because the governing faculty has learned to receive them without automatically endorsing them. This is not the same as suppression. The Stoics were explicit about this. Chrysippus did not argue that passions were to be eliminated. He argued that they were to be examined. The impression arrives. The impulse arises. The hegemonikon considers, is this impression accurate? Is this impulse one I actually endorse when I examine it clearly? If yes, proceed. If no, decline. The practice is not numbness. It is precision. And the person who practices it with consistency is, in the most meaningful sense, more themselves than the person who simply follows whatever the mind produces. There is an uncomfortable implication here that the philosophy of mind, in its Stoic form, does not try to soften. If most people are living primarily from impression and impulse, if the hegemonikon is largely dormant, then most of what people call their personality, their preferences, their values, is not something they have chosen. It is something they have inherited, absorbed, and mistaken for their own. The particular configuration of reactions that feels like a self is, in large part, a product of environment, conditioning, and habit. Not nothing, but not quite the free authorship that most people assume when they think about who they are. The Stoics found this liberating rather than deflating. Because if the self is not fixed, if it is not a given fact but an ongoing construction, then the question of who you are becomes a question of what you are building. And what you are building is determined by how frequently and how honestly you engage the governing faculty, how often you examine the impression before endorsing it, how often you consider the impulse before acting on it, how often you ask whether what you are about to do is something the clearest and most deliberate version of yourself would choose. This is the Stoic answer to the philosophy of mind's oldest question, not a metaphysical solution to the hard problem of consciousness, but something more immediately useful, a practice. The practice of becoming more thoroughly yourself, by learning to distinguish between what the mind produces automatically and what you, governing it, actually endorse. The self that emerges from that practice is not the same as the self that existed before it. It is smaller in some ways, fewer borrowed opinions, fewer unexamined reactions, and larger in others. More distinctly its own. The philosophy of mind, in its Stoic form, does not ask what consciousness is. It asks what you are doing with yours. It asks whether the faculty capable of examining your own impressions and impulses is actually being used, or whether the mind is simply running on the impressions it happens to have received and the impulses they happen to generate. Who you really are, in the Stoic understanding, is not something you discover. It is something you construct, deliberately, through the repeated exercise of the governing faculty on the raw material of your own mental life. Every thought you examine rather than simply believe, every impulse you consider rather than simply follow, is a small act of self-authorship. Accumulated over time, those acts become a character. And character, the Stoics understood, is the only thing that is genuinely and inalienably yours. Who you really are is not something you discover. It is something you construct, through the repeated, honest exercise of the governing faculty on the raw material of your own mental life. That is what the Stoic philosophy of mind points toward. And it is, in my view, the most useful thing any philosophy of mind has ever offered. If something in today's video shifted the way you see your own thinking, if it made the distinction between impression and endorsement feel real rather than abstract, consider liking this video. Because this kind of thinking, the kind that asks you to examine rather than just believe, deserves to reach the people who are ready to use it. Every like carries it further. And leave a comment. Write down one belief about yourself, one thing you have always taken as simply true, and ask plainly whether you have examined it or merely inherited it. The Stoics understood that the unexamined self is not really a self at all. It is a set of conditions. The examination is where authorship begins. Subscribe to Logostoic and turn on notifications, because the practice of governing your own mind is not something you settle in a single conversation. It deepens with each return. We will keep going together. May you govern what is truly yours to govern, and find, in that governing, a self worth being.